Okay, great. So welcome to Cecil and Megan. And I'm not sure which of you is going first, so I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourselves and share your screen as you need to. Thanks so much.
Perfect. I am Cecil, and I'm going to be going first. Megan, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself now also, or wait until your portion.
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that just I'll do it both times. How about that? That way there's no confusion. So why don't you go first and then I'll follow you.
Okay, perfect. So I am Cecil. I'm with the Northwest Network of Bi, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse. I've been with the network for about 3 years, and I'm going to be talking to you all about patterns of power and control.
And then I'm Megan Dawson. I'm an attorney with the Lavender Rights Project, and I'm going to run basically the Q&A section of the presentation. We're going to be bouncing off a lot of the concepts that Cecil is going to address and provide some hypothetical situations, and we hope that folks will participate in that discussion after Cecil's presentation. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so you all should be seeing a PowerPoint that's supporting LGBTQ survivors, domestic violence survivors. Okay. So just to give a little bit more info about who we are and what we do at the network, our bread and butter support that we offer to community is advocacy-based counseling for survivors of domestic, sexual, and hate violence, as well as harassment and stalking within queer and trans communities. We also have community engagement that we offer to community, a relationship skills class, we have youth programs, we do lots of things, and we offer training and technical assistance as well. So feel free to reach out to us for any technical assistance and refer your people, your clients to us as well, who could use some additional support. So I have pretty simple goals for the next half an hour or so. So we're going to define power and control, how they operate within the relationships with LGBTQ folks, both at a systemic level and within our interpersonal relationships. And then that framework will also be useful in supporting any other survivors that you all may work with in other contexts as well. So it's important to mention, I think, like we all know, right, that our communities are not monolithic. People bring lots of complex identities to our communities, and our experiences vary really widely by how we are racialized and gendered and what kind of resources we have access to. And queer and trans communities are also really scrappy. We're really experienced at meeting our needs and the needs of our loved ones outside of the formal systems that have long caused us harm. And this, for me, is like partially just a plug for Bi and For supports. Supports and services that rise up out of queer and trans communities that are created by and for us. So I want to offer a little bit of prevalence data to start. So we know from a longitudinal study conducted by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs that DV occurs in about 1/4 to 1/3 of all relationships of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And we also know from the last National Transgender Discrimination Survey that about half of all trans people in their lifetimes will experience domestic violence, and about half, again, will experience sexual assault. So it feels important to highlight here that within queer relationships, the prevalence of DV is about the same as it is in straight relationships, and that trans people do experience increased risk of violence due to systemic vulnerabilities. So we're going to be building out an LGBTQ cultural context. That's like part of what we're doing in the next few minutes. And ultimately, it's about understanding the impacts of intersecting oppressions on our day-to-day lives and how we show up in relationships and communities, and not just anti-queerness and anti-transness, but racism, anti-Blackness, ableism, and poverty, how all of these oppressions filter down through our experiences, intersecting with institutions, and with our communities and in our interpersonal relationships as well. All of these other bullet points really should be like indented, right? They're all impacts of oppression at different layers of society. So we can talk about decreased likelihood for queer and trans folks to access services, whether from mainstream organizations because of a lack of safety navigating formal institutions, because of a lack of representation of our stories, our experiences, our lives, our realities within mainstream narratives that make it feel unsafe or impossible to access supports, as well as lack of resources within our communities to direct to one another, to care for one another. Megan can speak more to all of this later on, but we know that there are huge relationship or legal considerations also. Lack of recognition and legal protections for our relationships, for the many different family configurations and parenting structures that we develop, lack of protections around employment and housing, as well as, you know, even when those protections are in place, biases amongst judges, lawyers, GALs, mediators, etc. So this is kind of the context underlying the rest of what we'll talk about. So I want to briefly define oppression, which is at its core the systemic or systematic overvaluing of some people and the simultaneous undervaluing of other people. So we know that this is systemic. So we're talking about lies and information about target groups that become socially sanctioned attitudes, beliefs, ideas, assumptions, feelings, etc. And we're also talking about, it's also institutional, right? So we're talking about mistreatment of folks in target groups across all social institutions in our society. So economic systems, educational, judicial, healthcare, etc. It's pervasive. So there's no place, there are no relationships, there is no situation in our society that we encounter that exists outside of these interlocking systems of oppression that are ultimately created. It's a strategy, right? They're created for folks holding power to maintain dominance over resources, including human resources. And it's also internalized. So we know that it lives inside our bodies and it informs, shapes our values and our behaviors. And we're all participating in some way in systems of oppression, whether we want to or not. And it filters down through all of our relationships, be they personal or professional. So to be more specific, when I talk about systematically overvalued groups, we can call them privileged groups. Systematically undervalued groups, we could refer to as target groups. It's just like one framework that we often use at the network. And privileged groups who are systematically overvalued are able to leverage their power within institutions to shape conditions that allow them greater social, financial, and institutional power and control. And that allows them to have greater chances of getting what they need to lead a safe and fulfilling life. Of course, any person is capable of violence, of creating an abusive dynamic within a relationship, right? And only folks in those privileged groups, only folks who have access to that cultural institutional power are able to shift, encode those prejudices into policies, laws, and norms. And we see that filtering down into interpersonal relationships too. We know, again, that no relationships exist outside of systems of oppression, and that our access to resources, our ability to leverage systems in our favor, and the internalized ideas that we have about ourselves, about what we deserve, about our own ability to self-determine, our own power over our bodies and our lives, and about other people, right? And their ability to shape their lives and make choices for themselves and their bodies, all shape how we show up in relationships. So fundamentally, at the network, we understand that systemic oppression creates the conditions societally that allow for interpersonal violence to exist by creating vulnerabilities for folks, right? By creating conditions in which some people are able to easily, readily meet their most basic needs and other folks aren't. So ultimately, we understand that violence operates in parallel or mirrored ways at different scales. So the tactics can look a little bit different across scale, but ultimately the patterns look pretty much the same. So this slide, I think, really powerfully illustrates that, and folks can read all of the examples. I'm going to focus on the second one. So we know that historically and presently, folks of color, particularly Black and Indigenous folks, have experienced and continue to experience reproductive injustice, right? So that influences both folks' abilities to access and maintain healthy pregnancies and to have all of the resources that they need to raise their kiddos. And also can look like forced removal of children, whether by CPS or the residential school system. We see so many examples of this. And this can also show up in interpersonal relationships in a little bit different ways, right? We see at the network every day how folks who are causing harm leverage legal systems to deny folks access to their children, knowing how queer and particularly trans people are perceived within those systems, leveraging stereotypes, for example, about trans folks being harmful to children or being predatory. We see folks leveraging a threat of a call to CPS, for example, knowing that CPS reliably does harm to Black and brown folks, to Indigenous folks. And so that threat is really powerful and can be leveraged to make a survivor's life smaller. So at the network, we talk often about self-determination coming before safety. If you've heard anything from us, you've probably heard some version of that. So we understand that abuse is, at its core, a 24/7 pattern of power and control in which a person's autonomy is interrupted, right? Their ability to make choices for themselves and to shape the conditions of their life is interrupted, right? And when we understand that that is the core of abuse, not necessarily an interruption of physical safety. We sometimes see patterns where there really is no threat to physical safety. When the core of a pattern is the interruption of a person's autonomy, then the solution to that is to restore self-determination, not necessarily to restore physical safety, right? And we'll come back full circle to add a little bit more nuance to that in a little bit too. So I want to do a little bit of an example with using sentence structure and how we talk about abuse and harm to illustrate how it operates. So another way to think about abuse is that it objectifies survivors. And what I mean by that is that an agent, in contrast to an object, is a person who is in charge of themselves. So they're the subject of their own life. They have choices laid out in front of them that they get to choose among. They act, they can reflect on their actions and make different actions the next time, right? Which is what self-accountability looks like. Again, they're the subject of their own life. This is an agent. This is like what in a world free from systemic and interpersonal violence we all would get to be all the time, right? And when folks cause harm in their relationships, when people abuse other folks, they are attempting to turn people from subjects, from an agent, a person who has choices in front of them, can like make choices, reflect, be accountable, etc., into objects, where an object is a thing that is acted upon but does not act itself, right? So here's that sentence structure bit. So in this sentence, Steve is the subject. So Steve is the one who is acting. Marcos is being acted upon, right? So in this sentence, Steve has objectified Marcos. And this is an example of, I think we like hear a lot in the media about passive language. So this is an example of like, or passive language to describe violence, right? We talk about people being harmed, people being assaulted, right? This is the like active flip of that, and yet still it highlights that dynamic of objectification. So another reason that this is important to highlight is that at the network, we understand surviving to be all of the many varied, brilliant ways that people who are experiencing harm in their relationships resist that process of objectification. And we know that it's important to not just focus on what is being done to someone, right? Not just focus on that last sentence, but to focus on all of the ways that a person is resisting a pattern of power and control. And part of why that is so important is that we need to understand what tools and strategies people are already using to resist their relationships in order to offer meaningful advocacy and support to help them grow those tools, right? If all we're doing is gathering information about what is being done to someone and then offering cookie cutter solutions that we think apply to everybody, then we're not actually honoring the like brilliance that that person brings to the advocacy relationship. We're not honoring that person's entire history of survival and all of the tools that they're already using. So we've all seen some version of the power and control wheel. This is the LGBTQ power and control wheel. And what I want to highlight here is that the wheel is not a checklist of behaviors that can be used to determine who is causing harm in a relationship. There is no way to create a checklist because any behavior on a wheel or on a checklist can be used to establish and maintain a pattern of power and control, or can be used to survive a pattern. Anything on here, including the use of physical violence, can be a valid strategy for resisting escalating interpersonal violence within a relationship. So in order to understand how any one behavior is operating in a relationship, in a pattern, we need to understand the entire context. So we talk about the movie rather than the snapshot. We gather information in our internal assessment process in advocacy about the whole arc of the relationship, as well as what's happening in the present moment, rather than focusing on any one like instance of physical violence or escalation. And we think about the intent and the effect of each behavior. So we think about all three of those things: context, intent, and effect, when determining how any one behavior operates. And if anyone is curious to hear more about context, intent, and effect and our assessment process, we do lots of assessment training. We also talk a lot at the network about this idea that violence is never the answer and how that really misses the mark. It's a really common refrain in DV movements and mainstream anti-violence movements. But we understand that that kind of expectation is an expectation that survivors are endlessly patient and compassionate and saintly in response to a pattern of a partner becoming increasingly violent. So we need to understand and create space for survivors to, again, increase the tools that they have access to without shaming or invalidating the use of tools that have gotten them to this present moment and allowed them to survive the experience of the relationship. I think, yeah, we already covered this. So just to kind of sum up that last little bit, in practice, we often talk about these domains of well-being. So this is a framework that comes from the Full Frame Initiative called the 5 Domains of Well-Being. And they offer that there are these like 5 categories of like needs that folks have in order to be well and to like lead fulfilling lives. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there's like physical safety, there's mastery, right? A sense of control over their life and their like circumstances, access to community. And part of what abuse does is it forces trade-offs between those domains of well-being, the same way that systemic oppression forces trade-offs among those domains of well-being. So in a world, again, free from systemic and interpersonal violence, all people would have all of those domains of well-being met at any given time. But within a pattern of power and control, folks are forced to make trade-offs and to choose amongst their values, right? These trade-offs can force folks to into making decisions that compromise their most core values. Yeah, so again, we need to be really mindful of the ways that I think legal processes in particular can contribute to shame around all of the ways that people survive a pattern of power and control. I'm just going to skip right into the next one. So this slide contrasts language and framing that is used in the criminal legal system with language and framing that we use in our advocacy at the network. So we talk about survivors and people who have caused harm as opposed to victims and perpetrators. And we do that for a number of reasons. We know, again, that the victim-perpetrator language objectifies survivors. And it also objectifies people who have caused harm, right? We recognize that people are more than just one thing. People are more than the choices that they've made in one context. We don't believe in throwing anybody away. And we also recognize that this criminal legal framework locates harm in individual instances, usually of physical violence, of behavior that meets a definition of a crime, right? Rather than in patterns of behavior. So the criminal framework focuses on the snapshots, whereas we're focusing on the movie, and understand, again, that any of those behaviors on the wheel can be used either to establish and maintain a pattern or to survive a pattern. And actually that the majority of the tools that are used to establish and maintain a pattern of power and control aren't criminal at all. It is not illegal to convince your partner to give you access to their phone so you can scroll through their text messages. It is not illegal to pressure your partner to quit their job. It is not illegal to badger your partner, relentlessly criticize them, right? And like within that context, we see it again and again, the so-called victim defendants who weren't able to be those saints, had tools that they used that caused them to have to interface with the system, right? Whether that is getting fed up, lashing out, and hitting a partner, or whatever it may be. We know that many survivors get looped into criminal legal processes. And the criminal legal system is inseparable from the racism and anti-Blackness that it has been born out of. And we see every day the way that people causing harm in their relationships leverage criminal legal processes or the threat to call the police, knowing how survivors will be perceived, knowing that those systems will reliably do harm, particularly to Black and Indigenous folks, disabled survivors, and poor folks. So I'm just going to show all of these. We don't have time to do this as a full activity today. We often do this as a participatory activity with folks, just to highlight the ways that any one single behavior can be used to cause harm or to resist it. So I can just give a few examples. So a person could hide their partner's keys in order to keep them from accessing their children or their community or a job, or to keep them from reaching out for support, from fleeing, right? I think all of that feels obvious. A person could also hide their partner's keys to, a survivor could hide their partner's keys to demonstrate a commitment to the relationship, to working through something in the moment, right? To keep someone from accessing a substance that could escalate behavior in the moment, so that they themselves can flee, right? Maybe they need the keys to like get the car and escape. And I'll skip to the last one as the next example since we're low on time. I think again, the like ways that a person causing harm might pressure a partner to have sex feel obvious. It feels obvious how that could be harmful, right? And I think a person who is surviving a pattern could also utilize that pressure, again, to demonstrate a commitment to a relationship, to encourage the partner causing harm to do one sort of sexual activity that might mitigate harm to them in that moment, or might be more bearable than something else that could come down the line if they don't. Maybe they pressure them to have sex so that they'll fall asleep, and they can have some time free of that person. Or maybe they've noticed a pattern that sex is correlated with physical violence, and if they don't have sex, they might face other consequences within that context. Yeah, I think that with more time, we could think of 100 examples for each of these. So I talked briefly about so-called victim defendants, survivors that get looped into criminal legal processes. We know that when survivors are placed in perpetrator treatment or face punishment designed for people causing harm, this further decreases their self-determination and safety. And we're gonna elaborate on that. So this slide on the right shows all of the different things that the DV movement has created thus far. I'll say the mainstream DV movement has created thus far to punish people who cause harm. And I use that language really intentionally because the mainstream DV movement has focused on carceral solutions and not community accountability, transformative justice, or other solutions that I think can facilitate actual healing in communities and address the root causes of harm. So things the movement has created to punish people: criminal prosecution, losing custody of kids, no contact orders, losing immigration status, pure messages like don't blame your partner, there's no excuse for violence, right? And then on the left, we have all of the things that have been created by the mainstream DV movement to support survivors. So we have really tangible resources like confidential shelter, support groups, legal protections in employment and housing, and we have more intangible supports, right? Safety planning, emotional support, advocacy, messages like, we believe you, you're not to blame, it wasn't your fault. And when we get it wrong as a movement, then we end up in a situation where people causing harm have access to confidential shelter, that is housing survivors, to support groups where they can learn skills and language and framing that they can leverage to cause further harm in their relationships. They hear messages like, we believe you, you're not to blame, that reinforce their own narratives, oftentimes, of the relationships in which they're causing harm. Right? They receive the benefit of legal protections, again, around the employment and housing, et cetera. Whereas survivors can face prosecution, lose their children, right? We see this all the time, lose immigration status, and experience the flip side of their narrative, the narrative that they've experienced of the relationship from a partner being reinforced by formal systems. So things we see all the time, folks abusing partners say, they'll never believe you, you couldn't get help, I'm the victim, you're actually the one causing harm, hear that every day. People would hate you, you would lose community, no one would want to be around you, you're just as bad as me, right? Again, we could elaborate on this list and we could have 100 things on this list. And these are the messages that are reinforced when we get it wrong, when survivors are interfacing with legal systems, right? And it's also important to talk about the ways in which service providers can themselves perpetuate power over dynamics that further decrease the self-determination and safety of survivors. So I'm talking about service providers, advocates, you name it, who are making assumptions about the needs of program participants, constraining their choices by offering prescriptive options, right? For example, expecting all survivors to want to be comfortable with, to be safe in interfacing with legal systems that ultimately cause them further harm, and make choices for people. I'm sure we've all heard a service provider talk about speaking for a client or doing things on behalf of a client, right? And that kind of dynamic does not help a person access their autonomy and ultimately to heal from an experience of violence. So just to kind of come full circle again, advocates or anyone can't rely on a checklist of behaviors. I think, you know, as queer folks, we all know we can't rely on gender to determine who is surviving and who's causing harm in a relationship. And we need to be really thoughtful about the supports that we're offering to make sure that we're offering accountability where it is appropriate and bolstering folks' self-determination where it is appropriate. That is it for my slides. Thank you. I think that was pretty good timing. I will hand it over to Megan.
Thanks, Cecil. I kept wanting you to stop during your presentation and have conversations about specific slides. I may ask to go back to those and reference those, but yeah, really great presentation. And I'm gonna talk about the kind of the nuances a little bit more in terms of the legal systems limitations and, you know, how to talk to your clients and recognize those lessons that Cecil has laid out so helpfully for us, and give you some examples so that we can start thinking about how gender and also gender presentation, you know, feminine or masculine traits can create problems for our clients within the legal system. So we'll talk about that towards the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, sorry, apparently I can't. Having to, okay, let's try this again. Okay, let's try. There it is. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and. All right, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. So in terms of the Lavender Rights Project, that's where I'm currently housed. I practice a lot of family law, a lot of domestic violence protection, order, advocacy, defense, and pursuit of DVPOs for clients. But basically, we do a variety of legal services as well as community advocacy and center the lives of Black, trans, gender diverse, and intersex people in all of our work. So that's kind of the framework that we're coming from. And what we see are disproportionate levels of poverty, housing disparities, and gender-based violence. And so that's kind of the core of what we're addressing. So, so to expand on Cecil's presentation, the legal system perpetuates abusers and their power, oftentimes in a lot of different ways, but some of the specific things that I have seen just recently, not even during my career, but findings of fact that determine things like there was no domestic violence, that basically during a period of time, you know, during the relationship between two parties, the person alleging domestic violence had not met their burden of proof and proven to the court that that had occurred. And so having that as part of a record, a legal record, like in a divorce or a DVPO type matter, can often be used against a survivor. Court reports. So having court reports that define or solidify this idea that the survivor is mentally unstable, that they are making it up, that they're exaggerating, and that they need mental health treatment in a way that perhaps would provide restrictions. So restrictions in a parenting plan that prevent them from parenting their children fully, or at the same level, typically. So those are court reports that can be through family court services or the domestic violence services through FCS. Also GALs, guardian ad litems, which are special court-appointed investigators who write reports and do an evaluation of the entire, whatever the court directs them to report on. There's also requirements in 191 restrictions. 191 restrictions, for those of you who aren't super family law oriented or have never practiced it, those are just the mandatory or permissive restrictions on a parent's ability to parent and residential time with their children based on certain factors. So the factors are generally things that affect their ability to parent, domestic findings of domestic violence, a substance abuse issue, things like that, that would impact their ability to parent. And so the court may or may not implement findings that say that that person has those issues, and therefore the court would need to institute restrictions or requirements, things like mental health evaluations, perhaps, as part of the pathway to expand residential time for the parent who has those restrictions. What we do see a lot of, though, is certainly in those kinds of official court documents, pieces of evidence, or court orders, is that the abuser's narrative is generally predominant. This often happens, early on in a case. Somebody with significantly more power, or even a little bit more power, has the opportunity generally to define the problem. They get to court first. They ask for the evaluation. They successfully diminish the power and control dynamics that were going on in a relationship to harm to basically control the narrative. And so the law's acceptance, in the court's acceptance of the abuser's narrative is extremely can be extremely harmful. So what I have seen in my career is, unfortunately, sometimes people come to us and, it's especially with same-sex relationships, it is very difficult to know for sure if you're representing the abuser or the survivor. And sometimes you get yourself into a situation where you are accidentally advising or representing the abuser. And obviously, as attorneys, we have ethical obligations under the rules of professional conduct that we are required to follow. But as advocates, as people that are hoping to not perpetuate harm on people who are surviving these systems of power and control, there are things that you can do. And I'm going to go over quite a few examples that I have actually seen in real life, hypotheticals where the questions I want us to kind of focus on are, who has the power in this situation, who's making decisions, so who has the autonomy, and who has resources, access to resources, whether that be community, financial, just, systemic. So we're going to go over those kinds of issues. So I just want to throw this back up here. This is from Cecil's presentation, the power and control wheel. I'm sure that a lot of people have seen this. It's really helpful to just kind of get an idea of all the ways in which an abuser can diminish someone's autonomy and decision making over their life. And so, most of the things on this do not rise to the level of what we call a domestic violence under the statutes. And so, there are a few acts in this power and control wheel, punching, kicking, grabbing. The physical may be something that a court can use to issue a domestic violence protection order, but most of this behavior that you're seeing isn't going to, it's going to help you as an attorney or an advocate try to figure out exactly what's going on and what the dynamic is. But it's not necessarily going to result in any kind of legal outcome for your client that would be protective. So we're going to go over 3 different slides, hypotheticals. So we are going to, so basically we'll do party A and party B. And if folks can in the chat, put in some comments about things they're observing or who you feel has the power, who you feel has the resources in this situation. So party A, and in this case, is a non-binary AFAB, which means assigned female at birth, and it's just a term that that is useful for helping to see kind of how a court might see it. So moves into a housing situation, roommate situation, joins the lease, signs a lease, files a DVPO many months after moving out successfully, alleging sexual assault against party B, and was able to get out of the lease, and has had no problems with the financial side of that lease, and is somebody who's employed. Party B is a transgender woman, is one of the original roommates in this housing, also alleges sexual assault while she's asleep. So the only contact that she's had with the party A since moving out has been related to the lease or the rent, kind of rent issues, and is a grad student. So is on a fixed income, is in poverty kind of indefinitely. Not all grad students, but this particular grad student. So all right, so a DVPO was sought by party A against party B. Who's the survivor here? Who's the abuser? What are some things that folks are observing about this fact pattern, and the ways that that might be? I'm gonna just scroll out to look at the chat. Sorry. Okay, great. Okay, so or if people want to come off mute, make some comments. So folks are, what I'm reading in the chat is, it seems like they both ID as survivors, certainly. Most abusers who go into a DV situation are going to identify as a survivor. So that's not necessarily helpful information, unfortunately. Party A has more financial resources. That's true. And then the party says basically, can't tell, maybe both. I do think that that is definitely possible. Yeah, so the things that I'm observing are the fact that yeah, and Denise is saying, have to wonder why Party A is seeking a DVPO months after the move out. And I will say that is something that the court did notice as well. Party B may have more power as the landlord. That's right. Why is somebody seeking a domestic violence protection order when theoretically they've been able to get away from the situation, and there's been almost no contact, so I do think, yeah, could be a survivor. Need to interview more closely. What is the basis of DVPO at this time? And then they both have mixed power. I would say that is probably the closest you see to a to something that is real life. Is oftentimes the parties are have mixed levels of power, especially in LGBT relationships. And although these folks were not in a relationship, they were just roommates, and there obviously was some sexual contact. The cross allegations, right, are that's one of the bases for the DVPO, is that there was an alleged sexual assault. And yeah, so what I'm seeing is, the Party A may have been motivated by so in DVPO world, if you are granted a DVPO, that is the only way pretty much you can get out of a lease. So this person had subleased their room. I don't believe that was illegal. I think it was illegal for them to do that but they still did it. And to get off the lease with the landlord, who is not Party B, by the way. Both of them are renters. So that was my suspicion, is that perhaps this was motivated by knowing that this person could get out of contract on the basis of being granted a DVPO and being found to be the survivor in that situation. So as a legal support, is it to determine who is or isn't a survivor? What I'm hoping folks are seeing is that, sometimes it's impossible to determine. And I'll go over some further examples. We'll get more and more into it. But as legal advocates, I would say that I think that we all like to think of ourselves as, not willingly representing an abuser. But if you've signed a fee agreement and you're in a legal relationship, you've taken on someone as a client, sometimes you will realize that they maybe are the abuser and you are stuck. And obviously you have to represent them to the best of your ability. So I'm seeing some other comments. So that Tanya says that she's seen, or they've seen a DVPO that was used to retrieve property. So that is another motivation. If somebody wants to go and get a couch out of a residence, they could do that with a civil standby, having a DVPO. And then Melissa says, I have no way of really deeply knowing. When in doubt, I generally tend to look at who left, especially in a controlling situations, because at least that reinforces distancing. And I think that's a really good point. When we go back to that power and control wheel, are they trying to get away from the relationship? Are they trying to maintain ties? Do they have any control over the other person? And sometimes you can't have that information. So Denise also says, I had thought that LLs have to allow survivors, landlords, to survivors to break a lease with an advocate statement, not requiring a full DVPO. That might be true. I do know that with a full DVPO, they're able to get out of their lease. That is one of the exceptions that I think landlords in the state at least are familiar with and have, if they're more, if they're a larger landlord, they've seen stuff like this before. So, but yeah, I'm not sure about that answer, Denise. So, yeah, there's really no way to know. I would say, in this case, the case was dismissed, and primarily the court saw it as a point in time. So, the alleged harm was so remote, so far in the past, and the person asking for the DVPO was no longer in danger, and I think in the court's eyes. And so that's what actually happened. But yeah, it was a toughie. Okay, so the next one is so it was a same-sex relationship. The one party was more feminine than the other. They were living together. One party was, however, unfortunately, had moved to the U.S., not being an English speaker, and had gotten themselves into a really difficult situation here. Couldn't work, really no family or friends. Their relationship imploded pretty much as soon as he got here. And he had very little financial support. And he was alleging that he didn't have access to his passport or property, which he says, was being withheld from him. The other party was a more masculine presenting person, but was working full time, had a job, did move out of the shared apartment. So moved out of the apartment, was able to get out of the lease with this temporary DVPO. And then the police report said that there was a police report based on one act of violence, or the police were called basically. And the police report did determine that he was the survivor or the victim in that altercation. And he alleged that his all of the property of Party A that he had access to, he had left in this apartment, in that former apartment. And being a U.S. citizen, having a job, being able to move out of this residence, he had a lot more support networks. So this was really complicated, but basically there was a lot of cross allegations, and this case was brought. There were a lot of different petitions that were brought in, a lot of different actions. But what are folks thinking in terms of the power and control dynamic that just with this obviously limited fact pattern? What are we starting to notice here? So some of the comments I'm seeing, Party A appears to be more vulnerable based on these facts. Party A has less access to authorities, so resources. I think that's the conclusion. Yeah, I would agree that Party A is in a real pickle. And, if it's true that he doesn't have access to his passport, if he immigrated, even being able to leave the country is going to be impossible, so not impossible, but much more difficult. And so, he's basically trapped until he's able to get out of the country. And so, yeah, so Party B does have the police report saying he's the survivor or the victim. But yeah, Party B might be leveraging the system in order to maintain control. That's true, but he did move out. And there is a huge difference in systemic multiple oppressions faced by the parties. That is extremely accurate. And primarily it's the network of people around each of the individuals, and a stable employment. I mean, that's huge. Not being able to work if you're waiting for a work visa, or not able to speak English, that is going to really make things much, much harder. And then Party A will have a lot of concerns going to court. If undocumented, has cause to be concerned with going to court with ICE, and threats if considered an abuser to be deported. That's extremely true. Party A's status, whatever that is, perhaps it is technically a legal or documented, I guess is a fair way to put it. If they have documentation, that could be certainly threatened if a DVPO is issued against him. But I will say something that that I was really floored by in this case was the English speaking issue. So being able to present, oh no, we're at time. Being able to present evidence was very challenging for this person. And so, the court didn't want to read the evidence, the text messages, the information that they tried to present. So, okay. well, we are at time, it sounds like. I think we have to wrap up. We had one more, but we can submit, we can provide the slides if people want to take a look at those later. And thank you so much for considering this issue. I really appreciate folks thinking this through with us. And thank you so much, Cecil, for laying out such a good foundation to even consider these hypotheticals.
Of course, thank you so much. And thank you all for the space.
Yes, thank you, Megan and Cecil. This is really, really helpful. We are, we do see a fair number of folks who are reporting various kinds of domestic violence, which can include, violence between housemates, can include intimate partner violence, and sort of intercommunity violence, and all of the power dynamics that Cecil and Megan kind of laid out for us. So this is really, really helpful information.